Eye furnace dawn heat woke before the sun. It pressed up from the salt like something alive. The ground breathing in slow, shallow pants. Elias Roe trudged across Badwater Basin with a gallon jug that already felt empty and a conscience that never would be. He had chosen the valley because it promised silence and punishment, a place too harsh for memory to survive. He wanted the sun to scour him clean. He wanted the flat white salt to swallow his footprints and his past in the same bright glare. The basin gleamed like bone. Distant tourists were insects at the edge of vision. Skittering to air-conditioned cars, wind ran thin fingers over polygon ridges of salt. The horizon wavered and split, mountains floating on a mirage sea. Elias let the glare blind him and kept moving until the parking lot became a silver smear and the last human sound went quiet. Thirst arrived with the certainty of a debtor's knock. A low headache, a tongue like cracked leather. He measured the water out of spite rather than hope. The valley measured him back in older units, endurance, will, surrender. By noon he was a dark stitch on a white cloth. Heat needling him in every step, he knelt to touch the salt and hissed. The ground had gathered the sun and held it jealously. The air tasted like pennies. The wind carried a rumor of something metallic and old. He told himself it was just blood in his mouth. He told himself many things that day, and the desert believed none of them. He reached the edge of the basin at a stagger and climbed a badland tongue of ash-yellow mud. The valley folded in around him in serrated layers. Soft rock knifed into sharp ridges, shadows cut like paper. From a ledge he looked back on the great white pan and thought it resembled a skull cap fitted to the earth. The first tremor arrived under his kneecaps. A small private earthquake the map would never record. Elias braced against a sun-warmed boulder and felt that warmth bleed into him. Too much, too fast, a fever in the bones. The world smelled different, as if the heat had baked smells until they were reduced to their essences. Salt, dust, distant sage, the copper aftertaste of lightning with no storm in sight. On the wind came a sound that did not belong. It rode the air like a line plucked on a heavy string, low and resonant, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Coyotes, Elias thought. But his skin prickled in disagreement. Coyotes made sense, and nothing about the noise cared for sense. He kept moving because that was all he had left. Past Devil's Golf Course where salt had frozen in razor spires that could gut a boot. Past a little wooden sign listing rules that felt jaunty and cruel. Past a raven that watched him from a post with the boredom of a priest at a sinner's 10th confession. By the time he saw Furnace Creek shimmer out of the heat like a mirage wearing a name tag, the sun had tipped, but not relented. He could smell water, he could smell people. He could smell, absurdly, himself. And the scent was not right, too sharp, too animal. A new thread braided through his sweat, one he couldn't place and didn't want to. Evening shaved the sky thin. The sun slid behind the funeral mountains. And in its absence another coin rose, red through the haze. Burned and flawed as if it had been left too long on a hot plate. Elias watched it lift over the Badlands and felt the interior tremor deepen from nuisance to command. Muscles tightened without his consent. A brittle ache ran through the long bones of his arms as if someone were twisting them with slow, delighted patience. He camped in the scrub beyond the mesquite flat sand dunes. Sand ticked like a clock in the cooling wind. A ranger truck murmured along the distant road and was gone. The world narrowed to stars and heat stored in stone, and a pulse that didn't match the beat in his neck. Elias held his forearms and felt ridges under the skin that had not been there in the morning. New architecture rising in the frame. When the moon cleared the haze, his body answered no pitiful gradualism, no polite warnings. The desert did nothing politely. Bones bent wetly, tendons sang like bowstrings drawn to breaking. Skin blistered with the effort of containing what wanted out. He tried to breathe and found his lungs learning a larger measure of air, the chest widening to make room, ribs recounting themselves like a hurried abacus. He clawed at the ground to anchor himself, and his nails tore the dirt in long, obscene curls. A sound came out of him that belonged to older things. The dunes carried it, and the mountains returned it. And the night tilted to listen by the time the sound died. Elias Roe was not what he had been. Heat had not just punished him. It had forged him. The valley had fed him its story and written new margins in his flesh. He rose in a body that fit the land, long, heavy. knotted with power like a juniper that had suffered 1,000 droughts and learned to live anyway. The air that had scalded human lungs came sweet and deep. Every grain of sand announced itself. Every rodent heartbeat tremored underfoot. Every trace of salt and metal and ancient dryness printed on the world like letters he could finally read. The moon struck his fur and found it the color of ash. His eyes gathered the starlight and returned it as an ember glow. He looked toward the dunes where humans had dragged sleds and laughter in daylight and saw another map laid over it in scent. Fear stained into footprints, the sharp tang of sunscreen, the iron ghost of blood from a scraped knee, the burrow of a kangaroo rat, like a coin slot under the sand. He ran, not for prey, not for joy, for relief, the pure act of motion to move the scream that still vibrated in his fibers. The dunes took him like surf. He climbed their leeward faces in 3 beats and rode the slip faces down in a velvet paws throwing avalanches that hissed and shimmered. The first sprint was a prayer, the next was a threat, the third learned a purpose. Night drew him to Racetrack Playa, a far black bowl at the valley's northern reach, where stones woke and walked when no one watched. Hours vanished under his stride, each mile a lick of the valley's long tongue. He crossed corridors of creosote, skirted an old mine whose shaft exhaled cold mineral breath, slid between Joshua trees with arms frozen mid-plea. The playa lay flat and dark as a dead eye, the surrounding hills peering in. He set paws on the mud and felt it hold him, a patient palm. Stones rested here with their long trails scribed behind them, thin scalloped lines that said we move when the world lets us. Elias paced between them and felt a kinship that had nothing to do with pity. He too moved in seasons older than weather. In commands that did not require permission, he wasn't alone. The first people came as LA laughter and brittle ambition, a pair of late-night influencers seeking haunted content. He saw them before they saw him. 2 heat signatures drifting, their breaths bright coins tossed into the cold. The wind carried the electric stink of their camera battery and the tang of nerves underneath the performative bravado. He did not want them. Hunger did not pick the easy flesh. The desert had written him crueler. He wanted the one thing that could stand up to him and make him certain he existed. He wanted the voice under the valley, the thing that had tuned his bones. But the pair saw eyes in the dark and performed terror until it consumed its actor. One ran, the other froze and became a geometry of poor choices. Elias passed between them like a shadow growing its own legs, and they fell in imitation of prey. But he kept going, stone trails stitched off in every direction, long cursive letters signed with patient, creeping time. He followed one that curved like a hook toward the north rim and found gouges along it. Fresh and deep, the cut of something heavy dragged by something heavier. Far above, a low thunder rolled with no lightning. The ground answered in small clipped tremors. Elias lifted his head and let the valley write a sentence through his nostrils. Something old had turned toward him and recognized a changed pupil. The lesson was not finished. Dawn found him scaling the road toward Dante's view, desert wind sawing at his fur. The world opening beneath in a white page of basin and a black line of road like a sentence underlined. The ridge broke the sun, light hit him like a physical shove, throwing a mantle of glare that set the edges of each hair aflame. Steam licked his paws, his kind had learned to fear silver. This place offered a different purity. Heat as metal, light as blade, he felt the sun want him undone, the valley jealous of the moon's work. The transformation had not been a gift. It had been a debt issued in a different currency. He tucked into the mountain shadow and watched day pour down the walls in slow, molten sheets. Cars crawled from the overlook like beetles flushed from a log. Minds flickered inside them, full of coffee and maps, unaware of the thing in the shade that could smell the sugar on their breath from a football field away. Rangers moved below with wary economy, shutting gates that the signs blamed on heat. They walked armed with bear spray that would season nothing here and radios that whispered code for fear. One paused and looked up toward the shade and did not know why the hair lifted on her arms. Only that some old mammal instruction had come back online. Elias watched her hand hover near the holster and recognized duty braided with doubt. That doubt tasted almost sweet. He swallowed it and kept still, downslope. A tour group trudged along a trail with sun hats bobbing. The lead man lectured in a voice that carried, "Proud of doom statistics, the valley kills with style," he said without saying. Dehydration in hours, heat stroke in one shriek of bad judgment. He never mentioned that some things here did not wait for weakness. Elias felt the interior tremor shift as the sun rose higher. The change held, but it started to fray at the borders, the edges of his teeth remembering a smaller outline, the wrists debating the number of bones they should contain. He knew instinctively that noon would be a blade. He needed depth, shade, stone. He needed to go under. Obihib crater yawned like the mouth of an old god, a dark bite taken out of the desert, wind moving in it with a voice that had practiced for centuries. Elias slid down cinders that hissed under his weight and found a ledge halfway where coolness pooled. The shade tasted like mercy and he hated it for that, but he took it. He wasn't alone here either. Far above on the rim, boots scuffed and voices skimmed the wind in syllables braided with fear. Rangers again and someone else. Someone whose steps fell with a hunter's rhythm. Not the kind of hunter who sought antlers for a wall. The kind who had seen something they could not prove on paper and followed it anyway until it ruined their career and remade their faith. The hunter's scent carried silver in memory rather than in metal. Old coins handled often, a rosary bead warmed by thumb, the clean bite of polishing cloth. He had brought ashwood and folklore. He had found podcasts and old church basements. He whispered instructions to himself. He hoped the wind would not hear. Wolves do not live here, he had been told by every pamphlet and expert. He had told himself that the map is not the land. Elias dug claws into cinder and waited. Wind filled the bowl, voices drifted, time lengthened. The sun moved one finger's width, then another. The tremor inside him steadied into something like a drum. The hunter came down with a rope and a stubbornness that disguised fear. Elias smelled a scar that ran from knee to hip, old teeth signatures under denim. He knew the shape of that story without needing to read it. The ranger followed, careful and angry about it. The anger pointed inward at the part of her that believed. On the ledge their eyes adjusted and met a shape that did not belong to any training manual. No one screamed. The wind took that job. The ranger lifted a can of spray that would season nothing, and the hunter lifted a piece of ash with a notch cut into the end. He had carved old letters into it and said them in his head now, like a man reciting multiplication tables at gunpoint. What happened then did not belong to daylight. The valley wrote a choir from hot rock and old ash. The hunter moved first, thrusting the ashwood like a cross to arrest a charge that had not begun. The ranger stepped to the side to build an angle, voice steady on words that tried to turn this into procedure. Elias rose on the ledge and felt each grain of cinder answer his pause. The world narrowed to vectors and breaths, to angles and returns, to the understanding that none of them would leave the same shape they arrived. He launched, the ashwood struck his shoulder and burned like an old oath. He twisted and planted. Claws sparked on stone and etched brief constellations into the dark glass of fused cinder. Ranger moved in. He smelled her fear held tight in its wrapper and knew it for courage. She brought the spray, and he brought the back of his paw, and the can tumbled, spinning out a useless cloud that flavored the wind with pepper and resolve. The hunter spoke a name that had never belonged to him, an ancestor borrowed for a blessing, and jammed the ashwood notch against Elias's ribs. Pain became light, light became weight. The crater hummed with it. A tuning fork struck by a god's knuckle. Elias felt the change try to peel off him like a shirt in a fight, and he refused it with a sound that came from before language. They wove a small war on that ledge. The ranger bled from the forearm in neat lines. The hunter limped harder and grinned like a man who had found proof and damnation in the same moment. Elias took the ash again and again, until the wood smoked and the carved letters blackened. He gave in return what he had learned, speed that erased distance, weight that turned bone to instruction. At last, the ash broke. It cracked with a noise like a prayer denied, and fell in pieces that burned the cinders as they landed. Hunter sagged. The ranger lifted her radio and did not call. She watched the creature watching her and understood that the valley had offered them a truth with a cost she could not pay twice. Elias stepped back, one paw at a time, eyes never leaving theirs. He memorized the lines of their faces for reasons he would not examine. Then he turned and went down into the crater's deeper shadow, where the wind sang like a choir in a low key. the kind you feel before you hear. The knife of noon chased him out of shade. Heat came down as law. The valley wanted its debt collected. The second change began with the cruel patience of an artist, removing a mask with a blade instead of hands. Bones unhooked, fur withdrew like a tide from black rock. Lungs remembered smallness and resented it. Pain found him inhuman again and made itself at home. He lay among cinders until his skin stopped boiling and memory returned with its old, mean voice. He remembered names and failed duties and a little house with a blue door and the night he had left it. He remembered that he had come here to be punished, and the valley had listened and said, "Let me show you how." By dusk he had crawled out of the crater and found the road again, a black vein running through white bone. His feet on the asphalt sounded wrong, too soft, too human, and the road pressed that weakness up into his calves until he stepped off into scrub. Furnace Creek winked through the heat shimmer like a promise delivered by a liar. He smelled them before he saw them. The hunter and the ranger, separate now, different roads, same vow. He smelled tourists and tires and diesel, sweat and sunscreen. Lost map ink and the metallic quiver that meant someone had cried recently and not told anyone. He smelled the valley above all. Its patient kiln breath, its appetite hidden in geology. Night rose like a tide, and with it the easier change. The moon was higher and cleaner, less red, more blade. Elias welcomed the unmaking and made something from it this time. He carried the memory of ash letters burning into cinder. He carried the echo of a ranger's almost call, the weight of a hunter's broken proof. He carried his own name like an anchor tied to a kite. He moved through mesquite dunes as the wind drew new ribs in the sand. He touched Devil's Golf Course without bleeding. He crossed the basin in a straight line and did not leave prints where he chose not to. He came to the old mine and stood in its black throat and listened to stone cool as the stars brightened. In that stillness he understood the rules. Simple and without mercy, the valley would keep him. Heat would raise him, moon would focus him. He would hunt what deserved it and leave what did not. Not out of ethics, but out of instinct, honed by a place that despised waste. When the rangers closed trails on heat advisory days, they would say the warnings were about temperature. When tourists vanished, the valley would be blamed. And the valley would accept the blame, and he would move within that acceptance like a king in a crown made of silence. A truck roared the thin highway, light spearing the dark. In its mirror for an instant the driver saw eyes that were not coyote and not man, and braked without knowing he'd done it. On Zabriskie Point a proposal moved from kneel to standing, and two hearts learned a rhythm they would forget later and find again in a hospital room. At Furnace Creek, the ranger sat in the quiet office with the radio off and traced the memory of claw lines on cinder with her mind until she convinced herself they had been shadows. The hunter in a cheap motel outside the park cleaned his wound with whiskey and wrote 3 words on a napkin and burned it in the sink. The valley breathed, the werewolf breathed with it. Both had learned a new shape, toward dawn, when the air was almost kind. Elias ran the flats and felt the world pull taut under his stride. The salt glittered like frost. The mountains held their dark. A raven followed at shoulder height for a few seconds. Wing beats whispering counsel, then veered away. Business concluded. When the sun's first blade lifted, the werewolf vanished into the canyons, leaving nothing but the idea of him and the thin thrill of a rumor that grew legs as the day warmed. The valley kept its secrets and wore them like jewelry you only notice from the right angle. Badwater Basin shone blind and white. Somewhere on the playa, a stone shifted a fraction and began dragging a fresh signature for anyone who cared to read it. The trails would say we move when the world lets us. The valley would say I decide the weather. The werewolf would say nothing at all. Because the story did not require words, only heat and distance and the kind of hunger that learns restraint in order to last. By noon the signs went up again. Heat advisory, carry water, turn back early. The metal posts ticked as they baked. The warnings meant what they said and something else besides. The desert had its own alpha now. The desert hummed underfoot, satisfied, and when dusk came, the howl that rose from the dunes bent the evening like a blade, and the mountains gave it back polished and bright, and the valley, old, patient, merciless, sang harmony. And for those who hunger for more, step deeper into the shadows with our Ultimate Werewolf Horror playlist, linked in the description below. In the world of horror, the scariest things happen when you least expect them, and trust me, You don't want to be left in the dark. Welcome to the darkness.